Of all the panels in the Select product line, the easiest to install is probably the shake panel. Because this panel is only 4 feet long, the expansion and contraction is greatly reduced, and therefore we can manage that movement quite differently than we do the longer panels. First, as you can see, there are no nail slots in the nailing hem. We'll place nails about every 10 inches or so, which will help control that movement. And secondly, the laps or seams don't lock together, they just overlap, which means each panel can move independently of each other. Wall preparation for the shake panel is a little bit different also. You do want to begin with a weather-resistant barrier system that might consist of a wrap and of course appropriate flashings around all openings, but you don't need to prepare to bump out the trim like you do with other Select panels by using furring strips, unless of course the project calls for it. Again, because we can restrict the slight movement of this much shorter panel, this opens us up for a lot more trim options. For example, you might want to use a concealed type trim option that incorporates a pocket for all types of siding, or maybe a vinyl trim option. Or you might just decide to use 1x material and trim out the windows first and then install the shake panel up against the trim, just leaving a 1/16 of an inch gap if the temperature at the time that you install it is under 70 degrees. And of course, that then can be caulked if you wish to do that. The method for starting the Select shake panel varies depending upon the situation. If you're covering full walls in the panel, you're going to want to start using the Select starter strip. To do that, you have to first determine where you want the bottom of your first course of shake to land. Measure up 4 inches from there and strike a line, and that line will be your reference line to install to the top of the starter strips. It's always a good idea to strike your line level and to start at the lowest point of the installation or the lowest wall. I've finished installing the starter strip to the line, and I fastened it about every 8 to 12 inches. So now I'm ready to install the first panel. Just lock the panel down over the starter strip and secure it to the wall. I want to keep my fasteners about 2 inches in from both ends, and I want to place them about every 10 inches or so. That means in a full panel, you'll have 5 fasteners. And be careful, if you draw the panel back to the wall, if there's a bow in the wall, you can actually pull it out from the wall slightly to straighten the panel. That'll make a much nicer looking finished product. Now we'll install the rest of the course, locking it down on the starter strip and overlapping the panels. If the temperature is 70 degrees or higher at the time of the installation, leave about an 1/8 of an inch gap here at the seam. If the temperature is below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, move that to about 1/4 of an inch and install the panels. As you install the rest of the courses on the wall, you want to make sure that you never have 2 keyways lining up course to course. To help with that, every full panel has an indexing mark on it. And here's how that indexing mark works. Locate the indexing mark the furthest to the left on the course below it, and use that to determine the length of that starting panel for that next course. Measure from the very end of the panel. Now install the panel, aligning the end of the panel with that indexing mark. The method for trimming around windows and doors depends largely on the trim system that you've decided to use. In our example, we're using 1x material. So to get the sides, obviously we just hold a panel up and create reference marks on both sides for that. To measure the distance under the window, place your tape measure up against the material, measure down to the top of the panel, and add 1 3/8. That 1 3/8 is the distance that the panel will actually overlap this course below. Now that we've cut the panel to fit under the window, we're again presented with a few different options as to how to install it. But before that, it's important to note that we want to keep the panel consistent, the angle consistent across the wall, whether it's under a window or not. And because we cut the top out of that panel, it's going to tend to want to kick back a little bit further. So more than likely, you're going to need to figure out what thickness of shim that you need, and you're going to want to install a shim underneath this window trim to keep that angle consistent. Now back to installing the panel under the window. As I said, there are a few different options here, depending upon the situation. What we want to do, whenever possible, is keep this lock intact. And the only way to do that and get it under the window is to be able to slide the panel in. Now, obviously, we can't slide the panel completely across because we have these two sections here. So we're going to have to separate the panel somewhere. In other words, split the panel in two, slide the panel in, and then using PVC cement, glue the panel back together again. The best way to determine where you might want to cut the panel is, first of all, choose inside a keyway. Just using a utility knife, we're going to cut inside one of these keyways. That'll make it less noticeable once we get everything put back together again. If you're limited, for say on the right side of the window, then you're going to want to cut maybe at this keyway and slide most of the panel that way, allowing you an easier time getting the right side in. It's a good idea to try to draw the panel back together tightly as you're fastening it to the wall. Because we have that shim under there, it's kept everything nice and flush the way it should be, and our seam has gone together and glued together nicely. The last thing that we need to do is we need to be able to fasten the top of that cut so that it doesn't move either. We'll use PVC trim screws. Place the trim screws about every 10 inches or so, and it's best to place them in the keyways. Then we'll come back and we'll paint them with color-coordinated paint. Now, I had mentioned that there may be situations that require a different method for installing underneath the window. For example, if I don't have enough room to slide the panels in underneath the window. In that event, it would require that I cut the lock off of the back of the panel. Now, keeping in mind that any time I'm removing the lock off of the back of the panel, I want to keep that panel as short as possible. So in my scenario here, I would choose this keyway as my separation point. That way I can slide the long length panel in. I could take a utility knife on my short panel and cut the lock off the back. Then place my short panel in, glue the seam together, and then using those same trim screws, place a screw at the top, but now I also have to come up about 1 inch from the bottom of the butt of the panel and place a screw there. And these screws should also be about 10 inches apart. I'm very fortunate here because the end of my 4-foot panel broke over top of the window. So it'll be easy for me to slide the panels from either side. Of course, if that weren't the case and it were a full saddle cut over the window, you could use the same technique as we did on the bottom underneath the window, cutting at a keyway and gluing the panels back together. One more thing. If the height above the window here on the panel is beyond 3 inches, you're going to want to place some screws in the keyways, some trim screws, to keep that panel back against the wall. And remember, we do want to keep the profile angle as well, so you may need to shim above the window to keep that consistent going across the wall. Of course, if you're using pocketed trims, the panel would just rest into that pocket. When you reach the top of the wall, you'll have a choice of whether to use a pocketed type product like the Select Finish trim, or just to butt the final trim against the soffit. If the latter is what you'd rather do, then install the final two courses in tandem. That way, as you install this course and secure that, you'll have enough room along the right side to slide the final top course panels in without removing the lock off the bottom of the panel. And then using the PVC trim screws, you can secure that top course to the wall. Now, once you reach the end of that course, you will have to remove the bottom lock off that final panel and lay it into place, and then again using the PVC trim screws, secure that into place. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if this final panel is taller than 1/2 of a full panel, we ask that you come up about 1 inch and place a trim screw along the bottom as well as along that top cut edge, again about 10 inches apart. That'll keep the bottom of that panel, the top panel, nice and snug against this course. And of course you want to go back and paint all the heads of these PVC trim screws. If you'd prefer not to have any visible fasteners in your top course, you might consider creating a pocket by maybe bumping out a trim board to come down over and cover those fasteners. Or you might want to use a product like this. This is Select Finish trim. This part actually incorporates a pocket right in the part. The way to use this piece is to install your final top course panel, but measuring down and leaving about 1 1/8 inch space between your soffit and the cut of the panel. Then fastening the panel accordingly, and then coming back and covering over the fasteners and the top cut edge of the panel with the finish trim. And the way you finish this off is to fasten the finish trim using either Cortex screws or plugs or Pro plugs, both of which will supply you with plugs that match the color and finish of the finish trim. Quite often, shake is just an accent on a home, in a dormer or a gable, or maybe just a second story. So you'll be transitioning from one type of siding to another. Here's a few ideas on how you might do that transition with Select Shake. If you're transitioning from another horizontal Select panel, obviously you can just lock on top of that panel and go. If you're transitioning from another type of lap siding, just make sure the fasteners in your final course of that siding are toward the top. You can then install the starter strip just laying on top of that and lock the panel over top, and it'll hide the fasteners, and away you go. Do take note though, depending upon the thickness of this product, you may have to shim that starter out from the wall slightly so that the Select panel will easily flow down over the face of that other siding. Or maybe you just have a trim board or a feature board along the bottom of a gable. You just want to make sure that you flash that properly and install the starter strip again so that it's a minimum of 4 inches up from the top of that flashing, so that the face of the Select Shake will easily go down over on top and lock fully on that starter strip. As you're installing the Shake up the gables, the same rules apply that applied on the sidewall. Those are, you can use pocket style trims if the project calls for it, but you don't need to. You can butt the product against the trim. Make sure that there are a minimum of 5 fasteners on each full panel, spaced about 10 inches apart, a couple inches in from either end. All fasteners should be about 10 inches apart. Use the reference mark on the panels to help ensure that the keyways won't line up course to course. And of course, depending upon the temperature outside, If the temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit or above, space the panels at about 1/8 of an inch apart. If it's below 70, move that to 1/4 of an inch.